Welcome, everyone. My name is Alta L Price, and I'm thrilled to be virtually at Pilsen Community Bookstore today with Isabel Fargo Cole. And Isabel and I initially were going to be together with you all as sort of a celebratory after event following the 11th annual Festival Neue Literatur, which takes place in New York each spring, and then Literaturlenz in Chicago, which brings Festival Neue Literatur brings 6 contemporary German language authors from Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and Liechtenstein to New York. And then 3 of those authors would have come to Chicago, one of them being Isabel Fargo Cole, with her novel, Das Gift der Biene. But we are I feel incredibly privileged to have Isabel here today in her capacity as translator. Isabel Fargo Cole grew up in New York City, received a BA from the University of Chicago in 1995, and has lived in Berlin ever since as a writer and translator. Her translation of Wolfgang Hilbig's Old Rendering Plant received the Kurt and Helen Wolff Prize in 2018, and her other translations of work by Wolfgang Hilbig and Franz Fuhrmann have been nominated for several awards. Since 2005, she has published short fiction and essays in German, and her debut novel, Die Grüne Grenze, was nominated for the Klaus Michael Kühne Prize and the prize of the Leipzig Book Fair. Her second novel, Das Gift der Biene, was published by Edition Nautilus in 2019 and selected for the 2019 Literatur Nord. From 2006 to 2016, she co-edited No Man's Land, an online magazine for new German literature in English. In 2013, she was co-organizer of the initiative Writers Against Mass Surveillance. And Isabel, I feel as though if we were to give your entire bibliography of translations, we would need much more time today. But I would like to just invite you to introduce, I think some of our audience today will be familiar with the work of Wolfgang Hilbig. You've translated 5 of his novels, am I correct?
Something like that.
Something like that. It's always a good sign when you start losing count. So with that, I'd just like to invite you to review introduce us to his writing, but also how you came to it, and your experience with it, and then we'll have you read some excerpts from 3 of your translations of his work.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, first of all, I'm really sad not to be in Chicago right now, but I'm glad that we can do this virtually. I'll start. Wolfgang Hilbig is a writer who is kind of something of an insider tip or a writer's writer, even in Germany. He was always kind of an outsider. He was born in 1941 in the town of Meuselwitz, the coal mining town of Meuselwitz in East Germany. Grew up in this very working class family, proletarian, working in factories, in the coal mines. And he kind of developed, even as a child, an interest in writing and read a lot of German classics, romantic Gothic writers, Edgar Allan Poe, and kind of came to writing very much on his own and was not in this working class environment, in this very socialist environment of the 50s that wasn't really necessarily encouraged to go in that particular direction, but he went on doing it on his own. He would work as a stoker in factories most of the time, because that way he would be kind of in the boiler room by himself and he could do his writing and have his peace and quiet. And he did kind of try to publish in the GDR in East Germany, but even though he was kind of ironically the prototype of exactly what East Germany said it was trying to produce, which was proletarian working class writers, and he was literally writing in the boiler room, he was not writing at all what they wanted to be seeing. He was writing very surrealist, dark writing, influenced by Kafka, influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, influenced by the German Romantics. and with a very dark view of socialist reality, of the reality of the working class and socialism. So he did try to get published, and he had some writers who helped him out, like the writer Franz Frumann, whom I've also translated. And he was able to publish a very short volume of poetry in the GDR. And after that was pretty much kind of shut out of the literary establishment. And then ended up going, he started publishing in West Germany, as a lot of more dissident writers in East Germany did. And so he started publishing in West Germany in the I think the 70s, and became quite well known there. And then in the mid 80s, he got a fellowship in West Germany and went over there and basically just stayed, but also found himself very much an outsider in the capitalist world. He was really turned off by consumer culture and went on writing, mostly focusing on this experience in the GDR, but also kind of also critiquing capitalist society. He was a person who was very much a loner, very much this, I mean, I'm working on his novel, I'm translating his novel Das Provisorium now, which basically is an autobiographical depiction of his experience going over to West Germany and not feeling at home in either society, and kind of going back and forth. And I've been thinking while translating it that he was very much kind of a prototype of social distancing. He was often very much holed up in his room with his bottle of liquor and working away at his very dark writing. So it's been an interesting companion to have in these times. So he's a very challenging writer. He's it's very, very dark, very dense, and sort of between philosophical and sensual writing, but very, very powerful and very, very honest. And so that really won him a very loyal readership in Germany. And I came to him when I came to Berlin in the 90s. A friend of mine recommended him, and I was immediately kind of swept away by just his very particular voice he has. And also somehow he describes this reality of Eastern Germany in a way that makes it very very immediate. It's you get this, you smell it and you feel it, and you can feel this grime, and it has this weirdly very dark but kind of oddly seductive quality to it, and really kind of draws you in and really captures this atmosphere. So he won a lot of, I think most of the major German literary awards, and died in 2007. So I think that's basically all you.
He won the Buchner Prize a few years before he died, right?
Yeah. So that's the major German literary award. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Should I just move on to the readings, or is there anything else that I should?
Sure. No, I think that covers it. And we'll loop back to, you mentioned the smells, and that was the first thing I thought. And I'm intrigued that you mentioned the combination of sort of philosophical and sensual. These are incredibly sensual books. In the literal sense of the word sense, like they speak to your senses. You are inundated with scents, and stench. But I'll let you dive in with the reading.
Yeah, so the first book I'm going to read from is called Ich, in German I. The quotation marks are an important part of the title. So this appeared in German in about 1993. And it's a very darkly comic novel about a writer, a kind of wannabe writer from the underground dissident poetry scene in Eastern Berlin, who ends up being recruited by the Stasi, so by the secret police, to inform on other writers in the supposedly dissident scene. So there's a lot of very kind of ironic convolutions of writers spying on other writers who maybe turn out to be, stool pitches themselves. And what really struck me about this book is it's just this incredible parable of the surveillance society. And I was always fascinated by how he really explores this mentality of surveillance, of state power, of people's own propensity to survey each other. He draws a lot of parallels between writers observing people and kind of exploiting their stories, or observing themselves and using themselves as characters, and drawing a parallel to other mechanisms of surveillance. And this book came out in 2013, which was the year of the Snowden revelations. And it was really interesting to see how, even though it's talking about a very different system of surveillance than we're familiar with now, there was a lot of resonance, I think, with mechanisms of state surveillance or more diffuse mechanisms of surveillance through technology. So I'm going to read a scene where he's come to the protagonist has come to a cafe, which is kind of a cafe where all the Stasi, the secret police, hang out, and he's come there to meet his handler, whose name is Feuerbach. And this is in East Berlin. I'd stopped wondering whether to find it odd that you rarely saw two people at one table in this cafe, but this behavior changed over the course of the evening. And so it was usually very quiet inside. It did happen that one of the waiters, if he was new, would slide a cassette into the recorder, the current hits would blare out, one of the guests would make his way to the front to complain about the noise, and the cassette would be ejected. It was clear that people were working in this cafe. Each of the exclusively male individuals at the tables, all were about the same age and the indeterminate years between 30 and 40, seemed intensely self-absorbed. None seemed to know the others, but all were on a first-name basis with the barman. And nearly all of them drank that peculiar beverage, far too expensive for me, which was known as a champagne shandy, and was concocted from beer. It was crucial to use a Czech Pilsner, which had become a scarce commodity, or better yet, one from Radeberg or Dresden. Berliner Pilsner came in for regular disparagement, and a mini bottle of champagne. I stuck to coffee and schnapps, even in the summer, as multiple mini champagnes in the morning hours still struck me as a luxury. Out of habit, I took my place at the window, which the others seemed to avoid now that I'd occupied it several times, where I sat hidden from the outside world by the gray-yellow curtain. It held the nicotine of years, as curtains in a non-smoking bar didn't need changing. With a good view of the street, and the pedestrian traffic right before my eyes, since the window ledge was almost level with the pavement. And if two people stopped outside to talk, I could even hear what they were saying through the big window. Not far from the cafe was an U-Bahn exit, the U-Bahn is the subway, an U-Bahn exit that I could easily see into if I tilted back slightly in my chair, leaned my shoulder against the window, and looked down the street to the left. It was a pose Feuerbach referred to as snoozing. When he came in, he'd greet me by rapping his knuckles much too hard on the plastic table, and I had to pretend to be startled. Usually, I'd already seen him through the window. He stood out, the way his long strides put him at the forefront of a wave of humanity pouring from the gloom of the U-Bahn, or perhaps it was also his disbelieving face that struck me, in some uncalled-for fashion, singling him out from the lethargic look of the crowd. Sleds of people mounted the stairs from the tunnel at several-minute intervals whenever a train arrived below. I seemed to hear the train's distant rumble, even up in the cafe, detecting it in the faint jitter of the coffee cup on the table, in the barely perceptible tremor of the window pane beside me. And then the people came, always twice as many from the city center as from the zoo in the suburbs. Each afternoon, the tunnel disgorged mind-boggling throngs, which dispersed as expected on the broad pavement. What if they suddenly massed together, ceased to disband, took over the street? There were certainly enough of them. In their multitudes, they could easily halt the capital's self-centered rotations. What if they suddenly grasped what they revolved around, life, and its progressive debasement, and chose to ignore it? And ceased to disperse? I lived in a world of the imagination. Time and again, my reality turned fantastic, anomalous, and from one moment to the next, the only tranquility left me consisted in a barely tenable simulation. No wonder. We lived under constant pressure to take into account behavior which might not even exist. We lived in a dichotomy. We were perpetually conducting intelligence, investigations to clarify how far reality had already approximated our imaginings, but we couldn't let ourselves believe that our imaginings might actually come true. No, we disbelieved our own imaginings, for we conducted constant investigations clarifying, for ourselves, that there was no reason to believe them. But it was difficult to investigate without imagining what this investigation was supposed to ascertain, and if necessary, prevent, if possible, nip in the bud, as was our explicit aim. Thus, it was necessary to simulate that the budding reality conformed with our imaginings. At what point, I asked myself, would we have outstripped our ability to decisively categorize the things we clarified as still belonging to the realm of simulation, or already as budding reality? The words still and already conveyed the crux of it. Could the simulation become reality, and where was the transition? Could what was still a simulation already have made the transition to reality before we had clarified it and brought it to light? If simulation could become reality, reality could answer us with simulation. If we had to concede this, we were probably lost, and so we couldn't believe it. So we could believe nothing, for what we did not believe did not occur. It could not occur from sheer disbelief. This we knew with adamant certainty. It lay deep in the consciousness of each of us. There was no deeper layer of our consciousness than disbelief. With our skepticism, we emerged in a straight, purposeful line from the Enlightenment. And now and then, someone went so far as to call disbelief the tenet of our faith. Disbelief was deep-seated. It was the growling coffee grounds in our guts. Ha! Maybe we drank too much coffee as we pondered. We were Nestle's best customers, someone had said. And when we transitioned to conviction, we drank champagne with beer, which made us jovial and disbelieving. So, there was no God, there were no phenomena, there was no subconscious, there was no turning back. This, if we liked, was the creed behind the cant. Nothing could happen that we didn't believe because we didn't believe it. And already we were indispensable. Before all the world, we could have pointed at what didn't happen because we didn't believe it. Once again, all we believed in was our disbelief. All the intelligence we conducted, never flagging, tirelessly vigilant, consisted of conveying the belief that nothing could happen. Nothing. To that end, we couldn't be wordy enough. Even if everyone knew it already, in the course of our investigations, we had to reconvey and reaffirm that the people out there on the pavement were doing no more than coming out of an U-Bahn tunnel, walking along, and going back down into the next U-Bahn tunnel. We unbelievers believed firmly that nothing dubious could occur, that they weren't massing together on the pavement, even if they came in groups and many groups, in crowds and multitudes and cohorts. That changed only in winter. The pavements emptied when darkness fell. There was nothing but the cars on the lanes of the street. We could have pointed right at the calm and cool-headedness that prevailed among us. But sometimes the too oft-repeated phrases seemed to undergo a strange reversal, and the cafe was too close to the U-Bahn for my liking. It happened that I spent hours unfolding my thoughts ceaselessly, far from drawing conclusions, staring through the curtain. Everything outside was gray, and I thought and thought about the people. The people. I thought when the streetscape came into focus once again, there were more and more people out there. With a sense of vertigo, I saw them climb up from the tunnel, wave upon wave, and scatter on the pavement. Now, in the afternoon, the intervals between arriving trains were quite brief, and the crowd poured forth with barely an interruption. What if they suddenly ceased to disperse, and all of them suddenly came into the cafe? What an idea to see hundreds of people crowding in, the cafe bursting at the seams, to see the tables swept clear of us pushed to the back wall, already pushed behind the bar. Soon still more would come, another train was arriving. We'd done them no harm, really. I should maybe add that this is set in the late 80s, so right before the peaceful revolution, where the crowds did actually mass in the streets and storm the Stasi headquarters and ultimately bring down the wall. So that's what this passage is pretending.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pretending being a very key word. And his use of this belief and disbelief, right, and skepticism. Could you say more about that? And I'm also curious about the interval of 20 years, right? So it was published in 93, which is fairly soon, relatively speaking, after the fall of the wall. And then it coming out in English from Seagull Books in 2013. Did you feel, thinking about how, yeah, go ahead, how contemporary,
Yeah,
or
it
the
took
relevance?
me that long to find a publisher. I started trying to find a publisher in 2003 for this book, and I kept being told, oh, East Germany, that's no one's interested in East Germany, that's not relevant anymore. It's this is kind of like a thing for the museum, and so he just wasn't. It was people really weren't interested in East Germany in the U.S. for quite a while. It was regarded as okay, it's over and done with. Communism, socialism, all that stuff. We won the Cold War, and this is all, surveillance state. We're past that now. And I think now that he did finally get discovered, and I'm very glad that Seagull Books based in Calcutta was the first to pick him up and take a risk on this book. I think now that he has appeared, I think people really did pick up to the fact that he is in this book. He's addressing a very specific historical situation in a way that becomes very universal, because he's really looking at these psychological mechanisms that are behind the need to survey and to control people. And this issue of disbelief, and there's a lot of talk about simulation in this passage. A lot of the themes of the book are basically about, in a very interesting and complex way, he's looking at the way in which the sort of a surveillance society leads to people really losing their sense of reality. So the Stasi is surveying this underground dissident scene, which in turn is observing the state, and it ends up being this kind of hall of mirrors. And the narrator, who's also basically kind of he's putting on a front, he's pretending to be just an average poet, and he's going around and hanging out with all these other poets, and then he's running off to the bathroom and writing his notes to report to the Stasi about these people that he's hanging out with. So he's kind of playing a double role, and this function that he's playing of putting on a front and observing people and observing himself. There are parts of the book where he's basically sort of tailing himself, or he'll see himself like a kind of a doppelgänger. He's really losing his sense of self because he's so busy observing other people. And that's why there are the quotes around the I in the title, is that at some point he's not really sure what his I is. And so it's really something also that extends the state power, because the Stasi, even though it's busy surveying all these people and these dissidents, completely manages to miss the fact that there is actually this revolution coming from underground. They're so paranoid that they somehow manage to get so caught up in their paranoia that they are completely impotent when it comes to the actual historical development that's coming at them. So it's really, really a fascinating look at these mechanisms on a personal level and on a social level. What happens when an entire society loses its sense of reality and can't distinguish between fictions. And he also plays a lot with postmodern philosophy rather critically. That was something that was very en vogue among dissident East German poets. In fact, this entire thing is based on an actual true incident where several supposedly dissident poets who were very active in the underground poetry scene turned out to be Stasi informers who were basically orchestrating. Much of the underground culture was, in a sense, orchestrated by the Stasi. So you get this very odd postmodern game of simulations, which Hilbig is a bit critical of, getting too enamored of this philosophy and getting too swept away by it. So there's a lot of really interesting things that he touches on that I think continue to play on in our own historical moment.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any idea whether he started writing this while he was living in the East, or was this all, because one thing that strikes me in all of his reading, and stylistically we'll talk about this after you read a couple of the other excerpts, I find stylistically he has these radical shifts, but invariably I am always very much in it. I mean, I'm there with the narrator. Yeah, how much was this him remembering his life, before he went to the West, or had he been actually writing? And to throw another question in there, these supposedly dissident poets, were they publishing volumes of poetry, or, I mean, was there a sense that it was all a front, that their real function was primarily to inform for the Stasi, or the relationship between the surveillance and the writing, and this, the whole sense of losing oneself, and I'm here to surveil others, and the sense of any sort of character sort of crumbles. It has this odd equalizing effect.
Yeah, and that the historical situation that he's writing about was actually incredibly ambiguous. There was this one poet, Sascha Andersson, who was this big, very, very active in the underground scene. He they had kind of small literary magazines. They would, chapbooks and punk bands and so forth in this kind of niche. Like the society in the 80s kind of allowed the underground scene to have its little niche existence. And so he was Sascha Andersson was one of the big movers and shakers in that scene, and then turned out to be an informer. And I know personally people who were in that scene and who were personally betrayed by him. And it's an incredibly explosive topic, not only because of the personal betrayal and just the sense that the things that they were working on, their poetry magazines and so forth, were completely corrupted by him having been working on behalf of the Stasi. On the other hand, there was a lot of resentment because this allowed the West Germans to kind of look at the East German avant-garde scene and say, oh, okay, it's all just a fake. You're all tarnished by this association with the Stasi. Of course, we would never have anything like that. We would never do anything like that. And so that for years, and also more establishment German writers, East German writers like Christa Wolf, were proved to have, had a minor collaboration with the Stasi years and years ago, and then they were completely discredited. I mean, it was very difficult in East German society, if you had any kind of if you got ahead to any degree, not to have had some sort of contact. It was just, and Hilbig himself, I think he wrote this all after the wall came down, inspired by the things that were coming out about that scene. But he had also had a brush with the Stasi, where they had, he was imprisoned briefly on a kind of trivial charge, and then they tried to get him to work for them, and he didn't, and then they just let him out anyway. But he did think, how easily he could have gone the other way and been pressured into working for them. So that was one thing that inspired him to write that book, and trying to kind of describe this alternative, this alter ego of his, who has a lot of autobiographical traits of his, and just put him in this other direction. And he did write some shorter pieces. I think either after he immigrated or still in the GDR, that kind of dealt with this Stasi issue somewhat more obliquely. So that was definitely always an issue for him.
Mm-hmm. That might be a good point to pivot to the next excerpt, from the Tidings of the Trees. And I actually wanted to ask you before, I noticed on the copyright page of both of these, and I think two more have since come out from Two Lines Press here in the US, that, am I correct that both the Tidings of the Trees and Old Rendering Plant and the females come from a single volume? Were these published as they were originally published in Germany?
Well, they came out, these...
or was it a posthumous collection?
Yeah, these came out I think both of them came out in the early, the Tidings of the Trees came out, I think, in the early 90s, and Old Rendering Plant came out in the 80s, I think. But they were, after he died, his publishers started putting out his collected works volume by volume, and they have one volume of his stories, and also he wrote, which I think is some of his best work, are kind of novella length pieces of about 20,000 words, which I'm really very, very fond of because I like the form. And you see a different kind of writing in his shorter work, where he really, the language is much more concentrated and kind of goes more in the direction of poetry. He also wrote a lot of poetry. I mean, he was very prolific. He wrote, he didn't write any drama, but he wrote almost every other short form of short fiction, prose poems, poetry, novels, stories, and these novellas. And so these are really interesting for me because they have this very, they have much more of the lyrical language, which crops up also in books like I, but they're more, they're less, I mean, I is a bit plot driven. It almost has a bit of a sort of a thriller plot, even though it's always being kind of subverted, also because it's told in a very nonlinear way. But these novellas are very much, in a sense, I mean, there are many ways in which Hilbig is, in which all of the things that he writes are like one big text. There are a lot of themes keep cropping up over and over again, and there's a certain landscape around his hometown, this kind of coal mining landscape, the strip mining landscape that he keeps almost literally revisiting. And in these novellas, or at least the two I'll read from, they both have this basic theme of someone going out from his town and just wandering around the countryside and looking for something. And there's kind of a mysterious place. There's a sense that he's lost something. So in the Tidings of the Trees, it's that he's looking for these cherry trees that used to line a road that went off into the countryside that he and his friends would walk along. And so he's kind of goes out in search of these trees, which kind of also acquires a larger sense of just the natural landscape being destroyed by the strip mines. And so he goes out in search of this cherry lane and ends up in the garbage dump and ends up kind of circling around and he keeps going back to this garbage dump where there are these mysterious garbage men who do very strange things, and he observes them. And so that's kind of the landscape of this novella. Should I just kind of segue into reading it, or should I?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just read a little bit from almost the beginning of it. So this starts with another one of his favorite subjects, which is writer's block. I mean, he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes, but he still kept writing about writer's block. I mean, it's obviously a very productive thing to write about. So he, when this starts, he's just bought a writing desk in an attempt to kind of pressure himself into actually writing. Weeks and months followed in which the desk tormented me with the demand to be used as such. It was a place from which no one chased me away, whereas the kitchen table had had precisely that agreeable property. Now I sat at the desk and waited for summer. Behind me, the damp cell of my poorly ventilated, barely heatable room. Before me, the fog-smeared window. There I hunched. bundled in cardigans and heavy tracksuits, in the baffled shunting of tenacious nights and half-awake days. And when summer came at last, and I could open the window a crack, corrosive dust swiftly covered the desktop, settled in my eyes with every move, crunched between my teeth, and clung in the corners of my mouth. It was wrought by the hot continental air, and that air carried the distorted and arrhythmic clamor of bells, and the ash had a dry, sour taste I took to be the taste of death. The dust dimmed my empty page's whiteness on the desk. The one sentence I'd completed in that half year threatened to vanish beneath the ash. Then I saw that most of my scraps of paper already bore that sentence, and I was holding the pen, about to set down the same sentence amid the grains of dust again. How long had I paused over the thought that no next sentence would flow from my pen tip? For half a year now I'd been frozen in this cliched situation. I realized I'd spent days pondering the hunched figure I presented to the public, a figure bent out of shape from sitting on my chairs, bent with the strain of squeezing a thought from my head. Wobbling on top, the thought in that head askew between the shoulders, as though I'd been able to approach this obstructive desk only by twists and turns, half attacking, half evading, and these torsions seemed to drill my chair obliquely into a swamp beneath me. Again, a spume of ash pelted through the window. The vapors of the night overwhelmed the desk like a disabled boat, a boat in heavy seas, slipping down an endless groundswell. And I could see it only in my contortions. No wonder I was a squinting monstrosity by the time I finally fled my desk. I had no place to sit. The blankness of my pages always had the same preposterous reasons. Meanwhile, I searched for different explanations. I tried to picture a future reader for my output so as to take my cues from him. My themes were utterly foreign to him. Indeed, the whole environment I conjured up before his eyes could only seem abstruse and outlandish, as though I sought to transport him to a world that, though familiar to him from earlier times, now seemed thrust to the margins, so that no previously valid form of description could be used for it. I wrote for an utterly impossible reader, for one reader alone, and that reader was myself. The citizens who peopled my streets, if it was even streets I was trying to describe, were dead, vacant figures or reflections mysteriously left behind in the glass of the shop window after the original images had long since moved on. And underneath these specters' cold faces was a void. The buildings that lined my streets were mere facades, behind which the gray drizzle of a broken film streamed. And at some point, the streets themselves broke off for no reason. It was impossible to forget that I was writing about things I'd already lost sight of. I'm writing about things that are vanishing, I told myself, but whenever I set out to do so, I produced nothing but declarations of that loss. I failed to snatch those vanished things back into the light. If I try to picture a tree, for instance, it's as though I've never seen a tree in my life. It doesn't seem possible to describe a tree, sadly not. If I want to put a tree to paper, I'll have to devise a story in which a tree crops up quite naturally, I said to myself. And I rushed outside to memorize a tree. For all time, if I can, I want to have it present, for at least one of all the stories that remain to be told, for a tree-lined lane down which I want to wander darkly someday, and one paragraph at least, amid the maze of writing, may the word tree one day resound. Yet dusk was falling, and my eyes, which were weary and which I didn't trust, could no longer make out the true nature of a tree. As always on such evenings, I recalled a road outside town that my childhood friends and I had often taken to a village several miles away, trying, a chief pleasure of those early years, to outdo each other by inventing improbable and fantastic tales. At some point, we seemed to notice that the realm of the garbage dumps, which covered a vast expanse outside town, had encroached threateningly upon the road. From then on, we avoided it, for the evil smells of the garbage heaps, often in clouds of smoke, constantly drifted in a broad front across the road. Haunted by the mania that in the hours left until morning I must set down a tree in writing, I raced through the commencing night. Cherry trees had lined that road, but clearly they were there no longer. For years I'd taken no notice. At some point the trees had vanished from our minds, but there must have been a time when we took their existence for granted. We called that road the Cherry Lane. It was that childhood time when a name so plain and clear was still possible. what ingenuity we've lost since then. If we walk down that road now, even if those if those cherry trees still lined it, we wouldn't be able to think of the name for it. Somehow, when I was just practicing that passage, it really resonated with me that this novella is very much about kind of being cut off from. One theme is the theme of people who went away, who left East Germany and crossed the wall, and that the narrator is cut off from, and then the sense of losing your connection to a place. And somehow that really resonated with me in the situation of social distancing and staying home, and maybe not being able to go out into the countryside, and kind of losing touch with these places around you.
Mm-hmm. It's very apt. I think it appears in a section of old rendering plants. Does he say they vanished? There are these sort of nightly recitations of names of people. I don't want to get the word wrong, but
that crops up there too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it struck me. I was thinking he doesn't feel like a nostalgic writer to me. I think a lot of times, people talk about nostalgie, and these East Germans who miss certain things about East Germany after unification. But it's interesting, harking back to the childhood ingenuity and the simplicity. That was just as I was thinking, he's not at all nostalgic, but there is this sense of a time. Yeah. I mean, I as I read this book, a cherry lane, cherry trees, we think of the bright pink flowers, the sunshine, the beauty, the very light scent, but none of that. I mean, we're so cut off from it in a sense. Linguistically, the concept is there, but in this book, it feels as though this never existed.
Yeah, the entire landscape is just, everything's been raised for the garbage dumps and the mines, and so it very much
sour ash and. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's not nostalgic. I mean, there is a certain nostalgia in this writing, but it's always for something very, like some little glimmer of beauty. I mean, he's very sensitive to beauty, but it's always like one little thing somewhere, like this cherry tree or a bird in this kind of wasteland. Mm-hmm. So he has memories from his childhood that will have this kind of this beauty to them, but often it's a very kind of uncanny, dark beauty.
Yeah.
There is a strong, I mean, he's always going back to his childhood. He's always going back to this landscape. So he's drawn to it, but it's not nostalgia in the sense that, oh, everything was great back then. It's just that it's his home.
Mm-hmm. And I think also that the characters or the narrators are so consistently doubting themselves. Was that he'll remember an episode and were the trees still there or were they already gone? That it almost makes the reader doubt, did these things ever exist?
Yeah.
Shall we go on to old rendering plants?
So this is an earlier novella. I think it came out in the 80s. And it has kind of a similar, quote unquote plot to The Tidings of the Trees, where the narrator is also wandering around outside in this wasteland, but it has a different, they're like pieces of music. They have certain themes that they pick up on and make variations on. And this, he keeps being drawn to an old rendering plant outside the town where animals were, boiled down and turned into soap. And he recalls that as a child, learning where soap comes from, and that this thing that you use to clean yourself is actually, produced by boiling down the blood, the bones and fat of animals, and he develops this morbid fascination with this place, and keeps wandering out to kind of circling it and getting near it. And then also it turns out to be a place that's sort of haunted by mysterious figures that you can interpret in a lot of different ways. And a lot of these, the tidying of the trees really kind of harks back to the building of the wall and these traumas of East Germany. This really works with a lot of images that evoke the concentration camps. There was actually a forced labor camp near his town, and he often kind of explores that. In the last novella that I translated, the females, he really focuses on this forced labor camp. Whereas here in Old Rendering Plant, he kind of approaches it a bit obliquely and just works with certain images to explore this kind of to delve into these layers of German history. So I'll read right from the beginning. I recalled a brook outside town whose current, strangely shimmering, sometimes almost milky, I once followed for miles all autumn or longer, if only hoping to emerge one day from a territory confined, I'll admit it at last, by the bounds of my weariness. And I followed this path as though to the beat of silent wings. When darkness fell, I'd begin to expect some horror, a blood-curdling cry perhaps, followed by silence. But nothing came. The hush beyond the town woods was the ceaseless presence of little noises. Farmland, meadows, and fallow fields, swelling up from both sides in the haze of ever dimmer days, seemed for stretches to throttle the brook to a mere runnel. It often resembled the bluish blade of a long straight knife slicing the terrain asunder, and the long-drawn wound seemed to steam. Some distance away in a hollow lay the inert eyes of two round forest ponds, their gaze turned inward, half hidden now by dark lids as the shadow of the forest's edge slid over their imperturbable slumber. From there I passed through withered cabbage fields on a footpath that turned to follow the brook's course. Beneath this path in the water tall grass grew, the grayed, wildly bristling fall grass of those dim days, obscuring my view of the quick, barely audible runnel. Soon, at almost regular intervals, rotten old pollard willows rose from the grass, and then appeared on the brook's far side as well, standing opposite the intervals between the willows on this side, leaning over just as these willows reached a sled across the brook's center, so that the branches sprouting from the swollen heads formed a virtual roof above the brook, beneath which, especially when the dusk grew dense, the water's trickling sounded louder, seemed indeed to echo as though in an elongated vault. And when I stopped and listened, I sometimes imagined myself within this canopy of willow boughs, and at times I thought I moved with the current, swaying beneath the black baldachin of willow wands and a boat of corrosive grief, unfathomably drifting in aimless circles to strand on the shores of another clime entirely. Here the voices of this current had grown to one dense noise, and the other murmurs from the dark that had sealed the evening's end could no longer be heard, though they went on all the same, perhaps as steps across the fields, or as a windy rustling through the leaves, or perhaps as the rolling racket of a distant railroad train, passing on, as though all night long its trundle and clatter must never break off. Then the water's noise was a trickle, garrulously washing my limbs, rising to flood and shroud me from all the outside things that still sought to infiltrate my weariness. And it was the noise of my weariness as it clamored and frothed, or I was more inclined to suspect a wide-awake scuttling, whispering, sleep-seeking shadows, groping and babbling, when the water washed the willow roots at the channel's edge, when it loosened a stone or handful of dirt from the bank, or grazed trailing grasses and caused the perception of an infinitesimal spraying or hissing, instantly impossible to attend to as it vanished behind me, or fell back behind the next hiss or spray. When I felt the brook carrying the noises away from me, I knew in my heart that I was on the way back, a half-unconscious way back, in a drowsiness I tried to run from, but that took shape before me again and again. It was the brook that was running away from me. It was the brook that was running from me. But its run renewed itself ongoing before me, going on to renew its onward rush away from me. And so I stopped at times to make sure the runnel hadn't reversed its flow behind me, or strayed off into a side branch, leaving me behind in total silence. I recalled chasing the water, its noise, for a few quick strides to catch a quickly fading snicker I'd thought I'd seen or heard a moment before. Yet already it had escaped me forever. Its memory was swept away forever. And before I knew it, the memory of its direction had fled from me in my drowsiness, and with it the direction I had to take back. I strained to hear which way the water flowed. I couldn't determine it. My hearing couldn't orient me as my eyes would easily have done. It was as though the water coursed over me, flowing through my weary brain this way and that, flowing without bounds, as boundless as the railroad noise that ebbed in the distance, but could never leave the territory amid which I stood. At the midpoint of that territory that concentrically circled the place where I stood with my eyes shut.
Thank you so much. And I do also want to mention what startled me a lot about this particular book was it almost ends in an incantation. You mentioned earlier that that he's written poetry as well, but linguistically, the transformation that occurs over the course of this novella, and this one's 109 pages of text. The other is, I think, just over 90, 93 or something. So it's packed full of it's, but it takes you on this entire journey.
Yeah, it really is a prose poem. It's a 100-page prose poem, and the epigraph of Old Rendering Plan is from Finnegan's Wake, which, or one of the epigraphs. So that says something about what he's. I mean, you can see that in the passage that I read. That sometimes the language just kind of takes on a life of its own and leads him. It's the language that's leading him on.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, the language just kind of somehow unravels.
It struck me, to get back to this idea of that we haven't even actually talked about yet, but that we were the whole thought behind this event is translator as Doppelgänger. And you mentioned when you were talking about I, and that the surveillance and the self-surveillance and the sense of self. But to my knowledge, Hilbig has never been translated into English before. You are sort of single-handedly bringing his work to English language readers. Correct me if I'm wrong about that.
I think some shorter things were translated.
But I wanted to ask you, well, it might seem banal to ask about punctuation, but there are ellipses and em dashes sort of throughout this, and it makes sense to me that the prose poem nature of it. I wanted to ask you about that, and also just how much what your experience is, because it's the Joycean nature of how language sort of starts leading the writer. As a translator bringing that to English, I sort of marveled, and I did not do an unfos comparison with the original, but even in these first pages, you get a sense of this, you're playing with alliteration and assonance in ways that sometimes having a knowledge of German, I can see it below, but it doesn't at all, it feels so natural in English. And I'm wondering how much of that is sort of there in the text, and how much of it you really have to sort of rework or delve into it.
Yeah, I mean, things like that. I mean, the em dashes and the points of ellipses, that's something that I think more consciously about, and those are things that I really consciously preserved. They're peculiar to his. He has a certain usage with them, but they're also something that's more typical of German writing, to have kind of an em dash to set off, to kind of emphasize certain sentences within a paragraph. So it's kind of like they're sort of like gestures. I mean, they're not really punctuation in some kind of rational sense. They're kind of like gestures that indicate a pause or an emphasis. So I felt that it's important to keep them because they are idiosyncratic, and you do get kind of an intuitive sense of what they're doing in English. They're not punctuating in the sense of kind of making the text more logical. They're really kind of more about rhythm, and so I was glad that all my editors have there have been a lot of discussions, but by and large, it's been okay to keep that that punctuation. And
I wouldn't change it completely if that weren't there. I'm glad. It didn't even occur to me that you would have a back and forth, but of course you would. Yeah.
Well, some editors are trained to pick up on non-standard punctuation, so you sometimes have issues. But it's just such an important part of the look and of the look of his prose that it's. Let's see if I can. Well, you can sort of see some of the punctuation there, but. Yeah, those are kind of conscious things that I think about. But otherwise, with the rhythm and the assonances and the alliteration, a lot of that is kind of, the best part of it is intuitive, let's say. I do consciously think about what are the different allusions in a word, or what is this image referring to, or what associations is he trying to evoke. But what really drew me to his writing is the rhythm and just the flow of the writing, and the way he kind of sometimes he'll alternate very flowing sentences with very abrupt or kind of awkward sentences. Sometimes he has a sort of an intentional awkwardness, and especially in these very flowy passages. Somehow it's just kind of intuitive, or just sometimes the translation takes on a life of its own, and I can't, not necessarily making really conscious decisions about it. I think things like assonance and alliteration, that's something that comes more naturally to me than rhyme. I'm really bad at rhyming, but alliteration somehow, those kind of things tend to kind of emerge sort of spontaneously. So. And since he does play with that a bit, that kind of flows in, not necessarily in exactly the same places where he uses it, but I hope in a way that kind of reproduces the feeling of the German, and also just pulls the reader along, because these books are very, they're very dense. They're often told in a very purposely nonlinear way, so that you're not quite sure, and the narrator isn't quite sure. What point, is this the third time he's taking this walk, or the 10th time? Is it, what year is it actually? And so what pulls you along is this voice and this rhythm and this progression of images.
It's a very propulsive language. Yeah. Well, Isabel, thank you so much. I feel as though time is running short. Any final observations? Have you thought about translating his poetry? Anything to say about, we don't really celebrate May 1st as Labor Day in the United States, but it's a huge thing in Europe. So any.
I hope they'll refrain from burning barricades, since everyone's supposed to be socially distancing anyway, but we shall see. Yeah, and the poetry, I've translated some of his shorter poems, but yeah, I'm kind of, poetry intimidates me somewhat. At the moment, I'm working on writing and translating his final novel, and we'll see where it goes after that.
And will that be coming out with 2 lines as well?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, before we sign off, I do want to just vividly encourage people, and I think our friends at Pilsen Community Books, have all of these titles in stock, including the 2 that we did not have time to read from today. But yeah, I would just really like to thank you so much again for your brilliant work. I don't know how much the Wolff Prize is known outside of sort of the German translation community, but it is very well earned, and I, for one, can't wait to read what the 2 of you, Wolfgang Hilbig and Isabel Fargo Cole, do next. So thank you so much for being here today, Isabel.
Thank you so much to Pilsen Community Books for having me virtually in Chicago. And thanks to you for initiating all this.
Yep. And to anyone viewing this, hopefully you enjoyed the excerpts, and we'll be back soon with more.